Hi, this is Tony Kent, and this is another episode of Tony Kent Writes and Cross-Examines. And today, sitting in a David Bowie backdropped witness box is none other than Paul Burston. Paul is a writer of crosses a number of genres. In the crime genre, he has written books including The Black Path, and last year he wrote The Closer I Get, which was nominated or longlisted as for the Not the Booker Prize by the Guardian newspaper. It is a book that has been incredibly well reviewed. If you look it up, you'll see, and I'm sure you're going to want to buy it when you've heard what Paul has got to say about it. Paul, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure.
It's I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to me this afternoon now, isn't it? It's not the morning anymore, it's the afternoon. So we've got 15 minutes to have a little bit of a chat about your books, and I think the focus really is on the crime books rather than the other ones, because unlike a lot of people I speak to, you write across the genres, don't you? I mean, it's a proper eclectic backlist that you've got there.
Well, I mean, I write crime mainly now. I started writing sort of black comedy, and they got blacker and blacker and less funny. So I realised I was really wanting to write crime. So I would very much say I was a crime writer now. I mean, I'm working on a memoir as well, a non-fiction book, but otherwise I'm writing crime now. So
well, that's good to know.
That's my home.
Well, I think you can tell that now from your website, because you've sort of you've relegated the non-crime to a different part of the page, haven't you? And the crime is dominated by. I think your first crime book was The Black Path, and then last year we had the Closer I Get.
Right.
Tell us, The Closer I Get we were speaking about before we came on, and I was saying to you that having looked through it and seen what it's about, it was great last year in the sense that it got some fantastic reviews, but if anything, during the lockdown, it's even more relevant now because it's about kind of online relationships, isn't it? And how the reality of online relationships.
It was inspired partly by something that happened to me, which is that I had an online somebody was harassing me online, and it got really out of hand and ended up going to court and all the rest of it. And the thing that I found really difficult to shrug off was this idea that somebody can actually, when you're being harassed online, is that they can harass you wherever you are, because we spend so much of our time online. Yeah. As writers, we need to be online as well. So as well as using social media for keeping up with friends and just for chit chat, I also use it for work. I was working for a magazine at the time, so I was running pages for the magazine and running their Twitter feed as well. So everywhere that I had an online presence, this person would be there. And I think now that we're living in these conditions we're living in, we're very, very conscious now of how vulnerable we can be online. I mean, there's been stories already of people hosting book launches and then being interrupted by people streaming, unsavory material and things like that. So it is a world that I think it's ever evolving, and we're learning how to navigate it constantly because it's constantly changing. Yeah, and there are threats there for sure. There are all kinds of threats online, whether it's to do with personal threats, whether it's to do with people trying to phish your identity or scam money off you or whatever it might be. So I think we need to keep our wits about us. And also, one of the main lessons I learned is don't respond to the trolls.
Yes, they're best left alone, aren't they? They really are.
Don't reply. Just don't reply.
There's a lot to be said for the block button. I hesitate with the block button in case, because you can think that it feels a little bit cowardly. But actually, it's the best thing in the world. It puts a stop to it, and then you move on.
Or I mean, we didn't have it back in the day when I was having my situation, but now we have a mute button. So if you mute them, they don't even know, because if you block them, they know you've blocked them.
And then they can come through somewhere else, another channel.
They don't know, and they're just ranting into the air, and no one knows. It's great. That's great.
Well, if I learn anything today, I've learned that. I'm going to start having to mute people. But the plot to The Closer I Get, Tom is the author, isn't it? Tom's the author character, and he gets into some sort of an unhealthy exchange with an online admirer called Evie.
Yes.
And it gets to the point where, in fact, he has to get a harassment order against her. It gets really very serious. But then things go on from there. Can you tell us a bit about the plot?
Well, I'd never been a witness in a court case before this all happened to me, and it was such a bizarre experience and quite a traumatic experience in lots of ways, although I wasn't the person on trial.
Yeah. You can feel that way when you're a witness.
Yeah, and I very much wanted to write about what happens afterwards, because I think there's an expectation with crime fiction and with crime stories that there is a crime committed, and then the perpetrator is caught, and then everything's wrapped up, and that's the end of the story. Whereas actually, what I discovered is that the impact of that crime lasted on me for a long time after the trial was over. So I wanted to write a book that actually started with the trial rather than ended with the perpetrator being arrested and put on trial. I also took the decision very early on that I wanted to not make it my story, but to make it the story of the fictionalized version of the person who is obsessed with this writer, because I found that much more interesting. So Evie's voice is prioritized. She's the first person narrator. Tom's third person, so he's slightly more distant.
Yeah.
We don't quite know him for a large part of the book, and that's quite deliberate.
Yeah.
I wanted to write about, I was fascinated by what would make somebody do that. What would make somebody keep on bothering somebody when they've made it clear to them that they're not interested and they don't want any more communication? What would drive them to do that? I find that I'm very interested in damaged, compulsive people anyway.
Yes.
And I think a lot of crime writers are interested in people that are perhaps damaged in some way.
Well, they're just more interesting, aren't they?
Of course, absolutely. Flawed characters make far more interesting company than good ones. I also knew that I wanted it to be a book in which there was no clear distinction where the distinction between who is the antagonist and who's the protagonist sort of shifts and changes as the story evolves. So you're never quite sure who's telling the truth.
Right.
I won't say more than that because it'll give too much away. But that was something I wanted to do as well, because I just think that morally, as a writer, it's more interesting, because I think as characters and as human beings, we all have good and bad sides. There was a moment after a moment shortly before the trial that I was a witness at, where I was out with some friends, two women writers who shall remain nameless. One of whom is from quite a tough East End family, and she said to me, because I was really in a state, really anxious about this court case, and she said to me, "Paul, if you don't get justice, there's other ways of sorting her out." And that actually stayed in my head, because for a moment I actually considered it, and that freaked me out. That actually somebody had driven me to the point where I was willing to consider something like that just to get them out of my life. And I thought, do we all know what we're capable of unless we're put into a situation where you're cornered and harassed? When I was harassed, it went on for over a year. It took me a long time to even report it, because I thought I didn't think anyone would take it seriously. I didn't think the police would take it seriously, and I'm pleased to say they did, and the CPS did, and we had an amazing prosecutor. But I was embarrassed and ashamed, and all those sort of feelings that witnesses often feel about when you're targeted like that. And I wanted to explore all of that in the book. So the books are kind of, it came out of a horrible experience, but I've turned it into something that's for me was very cathartic, and hopefully will provoke people into thinking a little bit about those relationships they have online.
I mean, and as I said, it's particularly important now, isn't it? I mean, it's particularly relevant because we're only having our relationships online at the moment. and you can find yourself being that bit much more willing to give that much more of yourself away that maybe you wouldn't be doing if you were able to go to the pub, and if you were able to go to restaurants and just to, wherever it is you socialize. Yes,
I mean, I think the temptation is to spend so much time online, and I think that much as I enjoy having chats and doing things like this, I really enjoy them. I think they're great, and certainly at the moment that it's good. It's better to have some communication with the outside world through this medium than to be just constantly looking at your own four walls. But I also think that spending too much time online has an effect on us psychologically. I think we become addicted to the pheromones and the likes and the responses, and sort of self-esteem issues can start to come into play, where you're not getting enough traffic, you're not getting enough hits, and you start to worry about it. And I think I'm quite prone to worrying about stuff like that too much. So I have to sort of step away sometimes and think, hang on a minute, you've got a book to write. You can't spend all your time on Facebook and Twitter.
It's also something of an echo chamber, isn't it? Social media is a bit of an echo chamber as well, isn't it? Because you are generally in You're followed by people who seem to agree with you normally. You can get to the point where you think your views are the only views and are the majority view. And then you have elections where you discover that they're really not. So it's not healthy in that respect either.
I do go to quite some lengths to ensure that my presence on Twitter and Facebook, which are the two I use the most, that my friends and followers aren't simply an echo chamber. I do deliberately engage with people who are very, very different political beliefs to mine. So long as they're respectful, I won't tolerate somebody being insulting or personally rude to me or my other followers and friends. Having gone through that experience I went through, I have literally one strike and you're out with me now. But I do think it's important to engage with people who are coming from a very different point of view, because otherwise the danger is you become very tribal, and I think politics in this country has become so tribal, and it's not healthy when things get like that.
It's like a football team at the moment, isn't it? We're just so people know, we're recording now at the height of the Dominic Cummings scandal. And if you follow social media at the moment with Dominic Cummings, it's just being drawn now along Brexit's Remain and Leave lines. And it's not about that. It's not about left or right. It's not about Brexit. It's not about Leave and Remain. It's not about anything other than right and wrong. It's not about anything other than they set rules that we all followed. We allowed our loved ones to die in our absence. And then he went out on a jolly jaunt for his wife's birthday in the Bluebells. I mean, that's the reality. It's right or wrong. And that's the problem. That you're absolutely right. It's become tribal.
And I think, I mean, ever since the whole Brexit thing began, which has obviously it's been hanging over us for quite some time now, I think a lot of assumptions that I certainly made about the kind of country I was living in proven to be wrong. I think, like a lot of broadly on the left liberal people, I assumed that most people broadly felt like I did, and were pretty accepting of others, whether it's to do with your racial background or your religion or your sexuality or whatever it might be. And there was a very rude awakening the last couple of years. And I live in London. I live in metropolitan London. And, I also live in Hastings part-time, which, of course, is quite a Brexity part of the country.
So it's a big difference, London to Hastings.
Yes, quite a big difference. Although also, there's always contradictions that go on here, because on the one hand, Hastings did vote overwhelmingly to leave. And you do see lots of England flags everywhere and stuff like that. But on the other hand, I've never, ever experienced any homophobic abuse or trouble or anything like that in Hastings, which I do experience in London, which supposedly is more progressive. So
I think I guess they're not necessarily hand in glove, are they? I mean, people are
exactly.
Everyone is different. Everyone has different views, and everyone has different reasons for them. Paul, I've just looked at the time. We're on 13 minutes, which means we've got just under 2 minutes left. You mentioned earlier that you've got to get off social media and get down with writing. What's coming?
I'm working on another psychological thriller. I usually tend to write from the point of view of the victim, and in the last book I chose to write from the point of view of the perpetrator largely. And this book this book is largely written from the point of view of a victim who becomes a perpetrator, and you slowly learn what it is that led him to do these things. So it's a male protagonist who commits a crime, and the book is really exploring the reasons behind why he did that, and you sort of learn about his family background. You learn about there's various timelines. It jumps back and forth between the present time. Well, it may not be this year, it may be last year for convenience.
They're just changing that 2 to a 1 again.
2017. And also the lives of his parents. So you meet his mum when she was a young woman, and his dad when he was a young man. So it's a bit of a broader canvas than the last book. I tend to like writing broader canvases usually. I like to have different characters and different timelines going on. It appeals to me greatly as a writer. I think it's partly because if you get bored or frustrated, you could just nip over somewhere else.
I do something similar. I normally have different locations and completely different storylines going on for the same reason. Well, again, the time flies when we're doing this. We've now got 14 seconds left. So I'm going to say I'm going to take what's left to say. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me today. Good luck with the continuing sales of The Closer I Get, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much.